Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Can't Give It Away on 7th Avenue, The Rolling Stones and New York City, by Christopher Mckittrick, narrated by Gary Bennett. Prologue. This Town's Gonna Make It. On October 20th, 2001, Mick Jagger walked onto the stage at Madison Square Garden, an arena he had performed in as the lead singer of the Rolling Stones 18 times over the previous 32 years. By then, the world's most famous arena had already played an instrumental role in the legacy of the band. All but one of the songs on their landmark live album Get Your Ya-Ya's Out, The Rolling Stones in Concert, were recorded during their first concerts there in November 1969, and clips from the same shows were featured in Gimme Shelter, the infamous 1970 documentary. Signifying the band's long history with the Garden, in June 1984, the Stones became the first rock group to be inducted into the venue's Hall of Fame. Jagger, however, was not appearing that night with the band he had fronted since 1962. He had not played with the Stones in over 2 years, since the conclusion of their No Security tour. In the months prior, he had been recording and doing preliminary promotional work for his 4th solo album, Goddess in the Doorway, which was set to be released in November. But on this night, Jagger was one of the many famous musicians participating in the Concert for New York City, a benefit show in memory of the nearly 3,000 New Yorkers who had been killed in the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center less than 6 weeks earlier. Jagger wasn't alone. Keith Richards, his childhood friend and the Stones' guitarist, appeared unannounced at the side of his longtime bandmate, and the Glimmer Twins were showered with cheers from an audience made up mostly of hundreds of members of the New York City Fire Department, the New York City Police Department, and their families. After they embraced each other, Richards stepped up to the microphone while strumming his guitar. "New York, how you doing, guys? You know, I got a feeling this town's gonna make it." Coming from the mouth of the quintessential rock and roll survivor, few rockers have been as up close and personal with death as Richards. It was a proclamation of endurance and hope. Richards, Jagger, and the house band then launched into an uplifting rendition of Salt of the Earth, the rarely performed but poignantly appropriate gospel-influenced final track on Beggar's Banquet. Before sliding into the next song, the disco-influenced Miss You, which celebrates the dirty decadence of 70s Manhattan, Jagger offered his own proclamation on the enduring spirit of New York City. "You know, if there's one thing to be learned from this, if there's one thing to be learned from this whole experience, it's you don't fuck with New York, okay?" Though Jagger and Richards were born almost 6 decades earlier, an ocean away in Dartford, England, the pair were speaking on good authority. Besides their intimate history with Madison Square Garden, both Jagger and Richards called New York City home for many years. Despite their English origin, the Rolling Stones can be considered one of the great New York City bands based on their long, colorful history with Gotham in their music, performances, and off-stage antics. The band's emotional connection with the city spans decades. A year after the attacks, Jagger allowed a song from Goddess in the Doorway, titled Joy, to be used free of charge in a commercial made by the city of New York to thank the rest of the country for their aid in the aftermath of the attacks. When the Rolling Stones began gigging around London in the early 1960s, it was impossible for them to know that their music would take them all over the world many times over for more than 5 decades. When Jagger and Richards had the fateful chance reunion at the Dartford railway station in 1960 that would eventually alter the course of rock music, neither could have imagined that they would both make New York City their home, and that Manhattan would become ingrained in the music and image that their band would create. Before the 1960s, popular music was rarely globe-spanning, and when the Rolling Stones was formed, English rock and roll bands certainly did not have that reach. While the Rolling Stones were devoted fans of American rhythm and blues and rock and roll, British bands that emulated their sound played London, and, if they were lucky, perhaps as far as West Germany. At that time, the transatlantic pop music exchange from the United States to the United Kingdom was almost exclusively one way, which explains the fascination British invasion bands had with American music. British pop music fans could easily find their favorite American artists at the local record store, but Americans had yet to show much interest in British artists. Outside of making a handful of appearances on popular U.S. TV programs, as Lonnie Donegan did on The Perry Como Show and The Paul Winchell Show in the mid-1950s, followed by his tour of the States in 1956, it was unprecedented for British bands to have sustained success in the United States. Rocker Cliff Richard, popularly regarded as the British Elvis, did a 4-week U.S. and Canadian tour in January and February 1960, and a second tour in August 1962, but he failed to make a major impact. In contrast, American artists toured England with great success. In fact, the Stones supported Bo Diddley, Little Richard, and the Everly Brothers on a fall 1963 UK tour, and would later open for New York City natives the Ronettes on their January 1964 UK tour. After all, the United States already had Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, and Muddy Waters. Why would America ever demand English imitations? When I was growing up, the idea of leaving England was pretty much remote. Richards wrote in his 2010 autobiography, Life, "My dad did it once, but that was in the army to go to Normandy and get his leg blown off. The idea was totally impossible." At first, New York did not hold the same promise for the young Jagger, Richards, and Brian Jones as another American city. Their love of the blues and chess records put Chicago higher on their list of American cities to visit. Though New York is the home of the Brill Building, which was still the center of songwriting and business in American pop music in the early 1960s, all of Jagger and Richards' idols had recorded at Chess Studios in Chicago. It's no surprise that during their first American tour, they recorded a few songs at Chess and met Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, Willie Dixon, and Buddy Guy on the premises. Though the Stones would develop a strong connection with Chicago, in subsequent decades the group would plant stronger roots in New York City and draw influence from the music of 1970s Manhattan. Of all the Stones, drummer Charlie Watts, who formally joined the group in January 1963, was perhaps the only member who had designs on New York at a young age. Watts had grown up a fan of jazz and had played in numerous jazz clubs in London with local bands. He was devoted to American jazz greats, and as a teenager even wrote and illustrated a picture book, Ode to a High-Flying Bird, as a tribute to Charlie Parker. It was published in 1964. Decades later, Watts recalled his early ambitions to The Guardian. "I wanted to be Max Roach or Kenny Clarke, playing in New York with Charlie Parker in the front line. Not a bad aspiration. It actually meant a lot of bloody playing, a lot of work. I don't think kids are interested in that. But that may be true of every generation, I don't know. When I was what you'd call a young musician, jazz was very fashionable." By the time Watts joined the Stones, they were already performing bluesman Jimmy Reed's Going to New York in their set, though Watts might have been the only one who believed the song's title. Watts' Manhattan Jazz Club dreams would eventually come true, but only after the Stones became the toast of the city. It was appropriate, then, that when the Stones made their first visit to the United States, they arrived in New York, landing at the recently renamed John F. Kennedy International Airport on June 1, 1964. It was less than 4 months after the Beatles' hugely successful tour, which featured iconic performances on The Ed Sullivan Show and ignited Beatlemania in America. Despite their perceived rivalry, in June 1964, the Rolling Stones were no Beatles. Their first American album, England's Newest Hitmakers, was released only 2 days before their arrival, and their first U.S. single, a cover of Buddy Holly's Not Fade Away, had been released in March in the wake of the Beatles' U.S. debut, but failed to make a major splash, reaching only number 48 on the Billboard chart. During the tour, their second U.S. single, Tell Me, was released on June 13th and peaked at number 24. Whereas the Beatles came to the U.S. as conquering heroes with I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You at the top of the Billboard Hot 100 single chart, and Meet the Beatles and Introducing the Beatles at the top of the Billboard Albums chart, The Stones were unestablished underdogs. They arrived largely unheralded and departed 3 weeks later, hardly better known. Yet on the touring front, the Stones would eventually have a far bigger impact than the Beatles. While the Beatles were truly the first globe-trotting pop band, they ceased touring after August 1966. The Stones were just getting started, and their best tours, and in particular their best concerts in New York, were still ahead of them. After following the Beatles and playing Carnegie Hall, the Ed Sullivan Show, and Forest Hill Stadium in the mid-1960s, the Stones would go on to play every major venue in the New York metro area on their box office record-setting tours, including stadium shows in Queens and East Rutherford, New Jersey, arenas in Manhattan and Brooklyn, and theaters and orchestra halls all over Manhattan. The number of stages the members of the Stones have appeared on in New York more than doubles when the members' solo concerts, including the pre-Stones groups of Ronnie Wood and both the pre- and post-Stones groups of Mick Taylor, are taken into account. Counting the number of times a member of the Stones jammed with another artist on a Manhattan stage, particularly in the late 70s and early 80s, there is more Stones history in New York than in any other city in the world. It's no surprise that when the Stones announced the initial dates of their 50th anniversary tour, 2 were at London's O2 Arena, and 3 were in the New York metro area. London might have given birth to the group, but it was in America, and in New York City in particular, where they truly developed into the world's greatest rock and roll band. Indeed, much had changed already for the Stones by the time they arrived in New York for their second American tour on October 23, 1964. Their second U.S. album, 12 by 5, was released 6 days earlier and quickly rose to number 3 on the Billboard charts. The original version of Time Is On My Side had been released as a single on September 26th and became the group's first American top 10 hit, reaching number 6 on the Billboard singles chart. They would play the song along with Chuck Berry's Around and Around on the Ed Sullivan Show on October 25th, the first of a half-dozen appearances the band would make on the career-making program. Much like the Beatles earlier in the year, the Stones' performance was answered by an audience full of girls screaming hysterically, especially when Jagger, dressed casually in a sweater instead of a suit like the Mop Tops, bobbed and weaved during the guitar breaks. America was hooked, and each of the Stones' subsequent studio albums, from 1965's The Rolling Stones Now through 2016's Blue and Lonesome, would reach the top 5 on the Billboard charts. Fans never stopped screaming for the Stones, especially in New York. While the Beatles' pop sensibilities remained firmly British despite their early covers of American songs like Twist and Shout, it was the Stones who more deeply mined American music, blues, rock, country, and even bits of the Great American Songbook, for their sound. As Richards said to the New York Times in 2002, "I think that's the difference between us and the Beatles. They were much more homegrown. We were always looking out. It was the difference between Liverpool, which to a Londoner is very provincial, and London, where we came from." Though the Stones would remain based in England through the end of the 1960s, their connection with New York City would grow each time they returned to the United States for a tour. Starting in late 1965, Brian Jones made several visits to Manhattan until his final one in September 1967. Jagger and Richards would both spend an increasing amount of time in the city, particularly when Jagger became well established in celebrity social circles during the 1972 American tour. By the late 1970s, Jagger, Richards, and the newest Stones guitarist, Ronnie Wood, all had residences in Manhattan and were common fixtures at nightclubs and social events. Former Stones guitarist Mick Taylor, who played with the group from 1969 to 1974, would begin regularly playing in New York and the metro area in the mid-1980s, and Watts would finally get to embrace his big band jazz club aspirations by bringing the Charlie Watts Orchestra and his succeeding solo bands to New York starting in 1986. Even bassist Bill Wyman, who officially retired from the Stones in 1993, would return to New York in 2001 to play a concert with his solo band, the Rhythm Kings. In addition to the band's extensive performance history in New York as a whole, New York City is the only city in which every member of the Rolling Stones has played shows with side projects, with the exception of Jones, who never had a solo band. Not even London, the birthplace of the Stones, can claim the same. As with everything with the Rolling Stones, the band's history in New York City is entwined with some of the most infamous stories of rock and roll decadence. When the Stones first arrived in New York, it was a city in decline. The 1960s and the 1970s brought immense social change to New York, much of which was reflected in the Stones' music. During the 1970s and early 1980s, the Stones' changing sound was influenced by the new music of New York City's nightlife, economy, and culture. In the years leading to the 21st century, New York City's booming economy paralleled the band's monstrously successful concert tours in the 1990s and 2000s, which fundamentally changed the music business. In an art form where artists are frequently decried by their fans for selling out, the Stones continue to write the book on marketing a band as a business entity, and have almost inexplicably gained even more popularity and financial rewards to a degree previously unimaginable by pop musicians. Richards knew that New York City would make it after 9/11 simply because it was the city that made the Rolling Stones the wildest, sleaziest, and most exciting rock band in history. While New York can claim dozens of homegrown artists, born and bred to sing of the streets and the subways, no band quite matches the spectacle of the capital of the world like the world's greatest rock and roll band. Chapter 1. I'm Going to New York. In the interests of promoting New York City as a modern urban center even in the space age, in August 1959 the city announced its intention to host a World's Fair in 1964 in Flushing Meadows Park, the same site in Queens that held the 1939-1940 World's Fair. Thomas J. Deegan, Jr., who was chairman of the 1964 World's Fair Committee, said the theme of the fair would be Peace Through Understanding. The objective was to showcase New York to the world and inject billions into local coffers via tourism, an industry that would come to dominate the city's economy by the end of the century. The plan was met with near universal acclaim from city officials, including Mayor Robert F. Wagner, Jr., who had been in office since 1954. Wagner saw it as an opportunity to remake the image of New York and decided to go to battle with the emerging counterculture. Prior to the announcement, seedier aspects of the city had been creeping into popular culture. The early writings of the Beats, including the 1953 semi-autobiographical novel Junkie, Confessions of an Unredeemed Drug Addict, written by William S. Burroughs, offered stark, uncompromising views of the city's drug culture and homelessness, as well as frank depictions of sex, including homosexuality. The Beat generation presented dirty truths of the urban landscape that city officials desperately wanted to eliminate. On March 14, 1960, the story Life on West 42nd Street, A Study in Decay, appeared on the front page of the New York Times, calling the block between 7th and 8th Avenues an enigma to New Yorkers concerned with the deterioration of the midway of Manhattan. The article cited the Grind Joint movie theaters open until 4 a.m. for their sexual and violent content as a prime draw for undesirables. The article also decried homosexuality as an obvious problem, along with loiterers, dropouts, vandals, pickpockets, and drug users, and went into detail about how they congregated around a rock and roll jukebox in the block's subway station. The message was clear. New York City's problems were out in the open for all to see. To combat these issues, Wagner's administration targeted prostitutes, homosexuals, and beatniks. Officials faced little resistance revoking the liquor licenses of gay bars, while police entrapped, harassed, and arrested homosexuals and prostitutes on charges of indecency. Eliminating the so-called beatniks was another story entirely. By the end of the 1950s, the American folk music revival was a growing movement in Greenwich Village. While jazz had been the predominant form of music in the area and among the Beat generation writers, the avant-garde tradition of bohemian artists embraced the stripped-down folk music in nightclubs and coffeehouses, though most events visible to the community were the traditional Sunday gatherings of folk musicians in Washington Square Park. The gatherings began in the 1940s, but by 1960 their popularity had increased 100-fold, and the park was filled with hundreds of musicians arriving from miles away, sporting unkempt hair and ragged clothing. To city officials and local residents, these beatniks represented the growing unwashed specter of social disobedience. In May 1960, former mayoral candidate Newbold Morris was appointed Parks Commissioner by Mayor Wagner to replace renowned master builder Robert Moses, the urban planner who had served for 26 years and overseen dramatic changes to the city's landscape. Morris, likely under pressure from Washington Square business owners and residents, began rejecting permits to allow the musicians to play in the park. For more than a decade, permits had been issued with little effort, and the process was such a formality that many musicians didn't even bother applying for them. Initially, the musicians ignored the rejections, but on Sunday, April 9, 1961, Morris filled the park with police officers to prevent them from playing. Nearly 3,000 folk musicians showed up anyway, and when they started singing My Country 'Tis of Thee and the Star-Spangled Banner in protest, cops arrested 10 performers. The overly large headline of the New York Mirror the next day read, "3,000 beatniks riot in village," which embellished the few rowdy incidents of the mostly non-violent protest. Yet not all of the media were against the gatherings. In his nationally syndicated These Days column, journalist George E. Sokolowski decried the decision, remarking, "For 17 years these songfests continued and nobody much bothered about it. The beatniks came with their whiskers, and their gals wore long hair, and all their faces were grubby, which is their symbol of revolt. But it is better to rebel by not using lipstick than to rebel by throwing bombs." He questioned the hypocrisy of Cold War-era America's boasting of its freedoms of expression in the face of communism, when photos of peaceful musicians being arrested were being circulated, ending his column with, "God save us from the stuffed shirts." On April 12th, Mayor Wagner announced his support of Morris and suggested that the musicians take Morris's offer to use the amphitheater in East River Park, 2 miles away instead. 6 other demonstrations followed, including one outside Morris's East 72nd Street apartment. A New York University student who was arrested at a demonstration on April 30th later hired lawyer Ed Koch, future mayor of New York, to represent him in a case against the NYPD for assault charges. On May 4th, the state Supreme Court upheld the ban, saying that the musicians were banned not upon any distaste for folk singing, but because hundreds of musicians playing prevented others from using the park for sitting, resting, relaxation, and meditation. Shortly afterward, the folkies realized that there was actually no law against singing in the park without a permit, only against playing instruments. Because of that loophole, 700 musicians packed the park on May 7th to sing unaccompanied, with police unable to arrest anyone. It was clear that the beatniks were not budging. Bowing to public pressure, Mayor Wagner announced on Friday, May 12th, that the ban on music in Washington Square Park would be lifted on a controlled basis between 3:00 p.m. and 6:00 p.m. on the north side of the park the following Sunday. The return of the folkies on May 14th went off without incident, though the Times reported that hundreds of musicians left behind a landscape of ice cream wrappers and beer cans. J. Owen Grundy, the editor of The Villager in Greenwich Village, wrote a letter to the editor of the Times that decried the decision because it brought an extraordinary invasion of homosexual and professional beatniks, mostly from outside, who seemed to take a special pride in appearing in public in the dirtiest and most unkempt attire conceivable. But on July 6th, the Appellate Division of the New York State Supreme Court reversed the ruling that supported the ban. For seemingly the first time, the stuffed shirts lost. Shortly thereafter, the folk music revival, practically personified by village resident Bob Dylan, who had moved to New York shortly before the Washington Square protests, exploded, and Greenwich Village became a tourist attraction and an entertainment destination, that rivaled the popularity of the World's Fair. It was indeed peace through understanding. Though trying to fight against the beatniks who had invaded the East Village proved futile, as the opening of the World's Fair approached, New York City officials became increasingly dedicated to cleaning up the city's image. On December 17, 1963, the New York Times published an article titled "Growth of Overt Homosexuality in City Provokes Wide Concern" by Robert C. Doty on its front page. The article detailed the New York State Liquor Authorities and the NYPD's efforts to shut down gay bars, which operated in secret and were run mostly by the mafia. However, the article was also an in-depth analysis of the legal, moral, and image issues confronted by the city. Doty wrote, "The city's homosexual community acts as a lodestar, attracting others from all over the country. More than 1,000 inverts are arrested here annually for public misdeeds." 3 years after the concerned article in the Times about the state of 42nd Street, Doty wrote that the undesirable population of the area was still a problem. In a fairly restricted area around 8th Avenue and 42nd Street, there congregate those who are universally regarded as the dregs of the invert world, the male prostitutes, the painted, grossly effeminate queens, and those who prey on them. The image problems that officials were trying to control in advance of the World's Fair faced an even bigger setback when one of the most infamous crimes to ever happen in New York occurred 4 months later. In the early morning of March 13, 1964, 28-year-old Catherine "Kitty" Genovese was murdered near her home in Kew Gardens, Queens, just 2 miles away from the site of Flushing Meadows Park, where the World's Fair was less than 6 weeks from opening. The story initially made little noise, but over the next 2 weeks, Metropolitan editor A.M. Rosenthal of the New York Times saw chilling angles of the crime. Genovese had been attacked outside her building by Winston Moseley, a 29-year-old man from South Ozone Park, Queens. Moseley initially stabbed Genovese twice in the back, seriously injuring her, but fled when one of Genovese's neighbors shouted out his window at Moseley in response to Genovese's screams of pain. Moseley returned 10 minutes later to find Genovese lying in the building's vestibule, unable to get into her building. Over the next 20 minutes, he continued to stab her, and then raped her as she was dying. He was arrested 6 days later when he was caught by police during an unrelated burglary. He confessed to the murder while in custody, saying his only motivation was to murder a woman. What struck Rosenthal about the story was that there were many residents of the building within earshot of the murder, yet none of them did anything to prevent the second and fatal attack. He assigned reporter Martin Gansberg to the story, and on March 27th it became a front-page headline in the Times. 37 who saw murder didn't call the police. The article was a damning portrayal of Genovese's neighbors, and the neighbor who finally called the police offered an indifferent explanation to officers as to why he didn't do it sooner. "I didn't want to get involved." The shocking story launched into the national consciousness, and to many it became the prime illustration of urban apathy toward crime. Later studies revealed that the number of witnesses to the crime as cited by Gansberg was a gross exaggeration, and that much of the narrative presented in the article was inaccurate. Yet the damage was done to New York's reputation. This was not the image that New York wanted to project just weeks before the fair. As popular as the folk revival was in the early 1960s, it could not compare to the pop music revolution that was to take place in 1964. On December 10, 1963, the CBS Evening News aired a leftover story about a long-haired rock and roll group called the Beatles, who had achieved unprecedented sales and popularity in their native Great Britain. The piece, which originally aired on CBS Morning News on November 22, 1963, it was withheld from the evening broadcast because of that day's assassination of President John F. Kennedy, was the first one on national American television to report on the Beatles. In less than 2 months, the Beatles would become the most popular rock and roll group in history. After their massive success in Great Britain, concert promoter Sid Bernstein, a New York native, was convinced that he could promote the Beatles in the United States and arranged for a promotional tour. The city's battle with youth music was over the moment the Beatles stepped onto the stage of CBS TV Studio 50 at 1697 Broadway on February 9th to perform.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?